Hi, everyone. Dr. Justin Goldston here, and we're back. This time we are back with Tom Raftrey, long time friend of mine. We hadn't talked in a while, so I'm very upset. But Tom, can you introduce yourself and talk about what you do within the sustainability and climate space?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Justin. So this is a space I've been in actively for 15 years at least, maybe a little more. I got into it profession. It was always an area of interest because I'm a biologist by training. Even though I work in the technology space now, I did biology in university, went on while studying for a PhD in biology. I was doing a PhD on biological control. I never quite finished it because I got distracted by technology, and there was a whole lot more money to be made on the technology field than there was in biology. But it's always there in my heart. You know, I'm a biologist and a technologist. They're my two passions. So I got into the kind of energy and sustainability space in around 2006 professionally when I got to design and build out a data center in Cork in Ireland where I lived at the time. And we completely optimized the data center for energy efficiency. We made it a hyper energy efficient data center because we wanted it to be as low carbon as possible. And I started giving a lot of talks about that at the time and got a name for myself in the green energy space. And then after that, I was taken on by an industry analyst firm to head up their arm, which dealt with energy and sustainability. So I led research in that, and we turned that organization Green Monk, and I led that for 7 years. And then I was recruited into SAP in 2016 as an IoT evangelist, but I had a heavy kind of side of sustainability in that as well. So I've been working really at the kind of the intersection of technology and sustainability for, well, since 2016, however many years that is. I'm terrible at maths. Sorry, since 2006. So that's 17 years. 17 years.
Yeah. That's a while. It's a whole lot, a lot earlier than what a lot of people are talking about in terms of sustainability. Whenever they want to hop on a sustainability bandwagon, you know, right before COVID.
It kind of coincides with the Al Gore Inconvenient Truth movie that came out around that time as well, which did raise an awareness of the issue back around the 2006 timeframe. But then with the economic crash in 2008, it all went away again, and it only started to bubble back up again after Paris in 2015, I think.
Okay, excellent. So I know before, thank you for that. I know before, you know, our discussion, you know, I asked a question about, you know, what work you've done in terms of carbon emissions and carbon credits and carbon offsets. And you said that you've interviewed a couple of interesting people on your podcast. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I have two podcasts. I have one called the Digital Supply Chain Podcast, and I like to have a bit of a focus on sustainability in that. And I've talked to several blockchain companies, in fact, who are in the space of, you know, visibility for things, be it agriculture and visibility of food, those kind of things. And then I have a second podcast, which is the Climate Confident Podcast. And in that, I've done a lot around, well, the whole aim or the mission statement, which is a very lofty term, I guess, of the Climate Confident Podcast is to highlight successful emissions reduction stories and strategies to kind of excite people and inspire them to take action as well. So in that space, I have talked to people who are in the offset space, definitely, and obviously the emission space.
Interesting. So based on those discussions,
I've lost your audio, Justin. I'm not hearing you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Hang on, let me try something here.
Yeah. What about now?
Yep, I can hear you now. And do you hear me the whole time?
Yeah, I can hear you the whole time.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
I can hear you again. It was I think a loose cable on the side of my machine there.
Okay. So based on those interviews, based on your experiences, what would be some of the challenges what would be some of the challenges? Also, what would be some of the benefits to tracking carbon emissions, carbon credits, or carbon offsets on the blockchain, in your opinion?
Yeah, so they're very different. So tracking carbon emissions is something that every organization is going to have to do. It's going to be regulated. The SEC came out with proposals last year that all publicly traded companies will have to start reporting their emissions from 2024, depending on the size, large ones first and then smaller ones after that. But by 2025, all publicly traded companies will have to report their emissions. Now, these were proposals that the SEC put out. They haven't come into force yet. They were put out for discussion. But it talks to a direction of travel, because you have similar regulations bubbling up in Europe as well. And it all, as we get closer to 2030 and we're not getting our emissions reductions targets by 2030, that's going to start to become more and more of an issue. And we will soon start to see every region start to require companies to report their emissions. And of course, to report your emissions, you need to be tracking them. So this is going to be a big thing. Absolutely. Tracking and reporting emissions is going to be huge. In fact, the SEC in their proposals last year said that the reporting would have to be out to scope 3 and they would have to be audited. So, all the big accounting firms are rubbing their hands with glee, and everyone is kind of scratching their heads because no one knows yet how to report out to scope 3. Those standards haven't been in place. So there's a lot of people talking about that and trying to come up with standards for that reporting. The offsets piece is different and it's more challenging. If reporting out to scope 3 wasn't challenging enough, the offsets one is even more challenging because it's hard to track, but also there's a huge amount of greenwashing going on in that space. And that's going to be one of the hardest ones. And it's not just the greenwashing, it's also the quality of the offsets. I mean, if I invest in offsets in a forest in the Amazon and there's a wildfire and it burns down, what happens to my offsets? Or, a forest in California, it doesn't have to be the Amazon or Southeast Asia, and it gets logged illegally, there go the offsets up in smoke, as it were. So these kind of things mean that a lot of the offsets are of questionable quality, I guess, or could potentially be. And so the verification and tracking of those is going to be really, really, really important. And the forestry ones are some of the most dubious, I would say. There are others, though. Enhanced weathering, for example, is one, and some of the nature-based solutions that are around investing in biodiversity, for example. They're interesting as well. They're a lot harder to measure, but they are ones that have a greater potential outcome. Now, as I say, the measurement of that is very challenging. I don't think there's any agreed standard around measuring biodiversity, for example, so that's going to be a hard one to track. There's been some great stuff come out of the IMF and Rav Shami, who's an assistant director of the IMF in particular, on putting a monetary value on the carbon sequestration services that are performed by the likes of whales and elephants, forest elephants. And that's an interesting one. He's working with an organization called Rebalance Earth to try and do that on a blockchain. They're working with the Gabon, the country Gabon. They're working with the government there to put a financial value on the carbon sequestration services performed by elephants, forest elephants in the Gabon, and then allow companies to invest in those, track it on a blockchain, and make sure that the money goes to projects in the area to help local communities, as opposed to going into the pockets of politicians.
Yeah. So I just received the thank you for that. I just received a text through LinkedIn. One of one of my researching peers, Daniel Krupka from Coin Bureau, if you're watching, shout out. But he sent me a message yesterday. More than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets by biggest certifier Vera are worthless.
That's right. Yeah, I saw that report came out last week or the week before.
Yeah.
And that talks to what I'm talking about. A lot of times, if you're investing in forest offsets, it could be for a forest that was never going to be cut down anyway. There was an existing one, and there's a lot of dubious claims made about the forestry ones. So and I mean, the organization there was supposed to be an organization that verified and had a good name, and suddenly it turns out 90% of their offsets are worthless is probably a strong term, but of dubious quality, certainly.
Yeah. So, yeah, and that's one thing. I mean, we're trying to do our best in this area, but you're always going to be, in my opinion, fighting an uphill battle because there's monetary gain, in this area. So whenever you made a point, at the introduction where, there was more money to be made in the tech field, which is absolutely accurate. So that leads me into another question of, given that, because like in blockchain, we have DeFi. Everybody goes over to DeFi because that's where all the money, that's the financial incentive within the blockchain space, right? There's tons of money to be made in DeFi, right? So there's also a refi space that kind of looks at that climate finance aspect to make a positive difference, right? So given that, going back what you said, there's more money to be made in the tech space, there's more money to be made in DeFi. How could we convince people to move over to the refi area because there's more sustainable benefit? We can go DeFi all day long, but the world may not be here in 20 years, right? We need to go to the refi space so we can have a world to live in. I mean, that's my views. I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think the global decarbonization project that we're going to have to go through is the largest project humanity will ever undertake, which means there's going to be truckloads of money, the likes of which we've never seen before, go into it. So there's massive opportunity here for everyone. The important thing is to make sure that the money goes to the right types of projects. The first thing is we need to decarbonize everything as much as possible. There are some industries where that's easier than others. The software industry is very simple to decarbonize. The glass, steel, aluminium, chemicals industries, aviation industries, they're extremely difficult to decarbonize. And so for them, where they can't decarbonize, they will need to purchase offsets. But they'll have to get, so the idea is to get as much carbon out of the system as possible, and for the remainder, use offsets. And the offsets should be a place of last resort. And then those offsets need to be verifiable. They need to be able to show that they're not greenwash. They need to be able to show that they are actually beneficial. And there's going to, for anyone that can do that verifiably, then I see there's a big market, and that should be somewhere where the refi folks can say, look, we've got this space. It's an enormous market, because even if I said it should be the place of last resort, the offsets, it's still a massive last resort. It'll be the biggest financial undertaking the planet has ever seen, or humanity has ever undertaken.
Yeah. And so that was an excellent answer, by the way. So I spoke with two people in this space. So I spoke with Drew from Klimadal, and then I spoke with another individual. From Toucan Protocol, and they were saying that in terms of moving an entire industry or the entire space from the Web 2 world to the Web 3 world, this climate finance is probably one of the only ones where you could move the entire, because it's a $2 or $3 billion industry, something like that, right? So you could actually move that whole entire carbon credit space on the blockchain. You can move it on chain, right? Because there's a small number of people that are controlling these things, and then you can work with those people, because they actually do work with those people, and they can move the whole entire space on chain, right? Okay. Now with the real estate industry, global real estate industry, that would be impossible, right? But people are trying to do it. And and also it's going to take a long time to actually do that, right? So if we're able to move, let's just say, the carbon credit, the carbon credit tracking, if we're able to move that whole entire space on chain, do you think that we're going to minimize this whole greenwashing space? We're going to provide more value within this space? And if it's transparent, do you think more money will pour in, because now everybody can see everything on chain?
That's the hope, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
Yeah, I mean, really, one thing to be aware of, though, Justin, is it is only I think you said $2 or $3 billion industry today.
Yeah.
But it's at like minuscule numbers compared to where it needs to be. So the amount of, I don't know the exact numbers, okay, but the amount of carbon that we're going to have to offset will be in the tens of billions of tons per year. And we're doing maybe tens of thousands today, maybe a million. So we have got to get from the maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million tons that we're doing today up to literally tens of billions of tons per year for it to make a significant impact. So this is a space that's going to grow enormously. And because it has a reputation for being mixed up with greenwashing, absolutely it needs to be, it needs some mechanism, whether it's blockchain or something else. It needs some mechanism to show, look, hey, we're 100% transparent. You can check every single aspect of this, from start to finish. And if you can show that, then its reputation starts to be repaired, and people are less dubious about stepping into the space.
So that's a good segue into the last question, which I hope is the last question. So given that organizations, primarily within the supply chain space, because that's the space that I play in, given that they're going to be required to publish, their tracking and greenhouse gases and things like that, what do you think is going to be the digital transformation strategy or the implementation path for large organizations as well as small and medium organizations?
It's a good question, and it'll vary with different organizations and different industries. I did an interview recently on my Climate Confident podcast with a guy called Luis Amaral. And Luis is the CEO of an organization called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And what they do is they're nonprofit. They work with companies to say, any company can say, we're going to be net zero by 2050 or 2040 or whatever it is. And, you put that on your CSR report, and you put that on your annual report, and everyone claps, and then nothing happens. What the Science-Based Target Initiative does is it works with companies to say, okay, baseline, this is where you are today in terms of emissions. Here's where you need to get to be net zero using science-based principles. And they have different templates for different industries. And you work with them to publicize the steps you're going to take to go from where you are today to being net zero by whatever date you set. Generally, it's around 2030. And you do verification steps for that pathway as well. And so it's things like this. It's setting science-based targets, measuring and reporting against them is the most important thing organizations will need to do. And I would be surprised if in the next few years, they're not mandated to do.
Yeah, I know that we just updated a class, a CSR class at Georgetown. So I'm actually on the advisory board at Georgetown, and we were updating the CSR class, and the director brought in this whole aspect of science-based targets, where a lot of people because like Georgetown, the government speaks with Georgetown a lot in terms of the research that's going on, and then the government actually brought in the idea of, what are y'all doing in terms of science-based target research? So that's one question that the government is bringing in. So you might have a good point where it may be required, So
I think it will. I think in some regions, certainly. I would be surprised if Europe doesn't bring in that legislation in the next 2-3 years. And depending, I guess, on the outcome of the next election in the US, it might happen there too.
Yeah. So that's pretty much all the questions that I had. This was very, very beneficial. So can you let everyone know where they can find you?
Absolutely. So as you said at the start, my name is Tom Raftrey. I have a website, tomraftrey.com. I have a Twitter account at Tom Raftrey. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn as well. There's not a lot of Tom Raftreys on LinkedIn. I have my Climate Confident podcast and my Digital Supply Chain podcast, both of which are available on any podcast app that you go to. Just look for Digital Supply Chain podcast or Climate Confident podcast, and boom, they'll come straight up.
And I would suggest that everyone log into those or subscribe to those podcasts, because they're absolutely amazing if you're in the sustainability or climate action space. All right.
Thank you so much. And Justin, you're an alumnus, Justin, of the Digital Supply Chain podcast. I had you on the podcast there a year or more back at this point, I think.
Yep. And that was one of the best podcasts. One of the best podcasts. May not be the top viewed, but you know what? Number one, it's number one in our hearts. Tom, thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Justin.
All right. See you, everyone.